At approximately 10 a.m. in Washington, a written opinion from the United States Supreme Court began circulating through the courtroom press rows, signaling a decision that would immediately reshape a central pillar of recent American trade policy. There was no dramatic announcement, no extended remarks from the bench. Instead, the legal language itself carried the impact. The court ruled that the legal authority used to impose sweeping global tariffs did not permit the action that had been taken. In a single decision, the justices removed the statutory foundation supporting one of the most consequential economic strategies of the past several years. The case did not ask whether tariffs were beneficial or harmful. It asked a narrower but more fundamental question: who has the authority to impose them? The administration had relied on emergency economic powers under a 1977 statute to justify duties applied broadly to imports from numerous trading partners. That law was historically used to freeze assets, impose sanctions, or restrict financial activity during international crises. The court concluded that extending it to create a wide tariff regime went beyond what Congress had authorized. Writing for the majority, the justices emphasized that tariffs function as a form of taxation and regulation of commerce, powers that the Constitution assigns to Congress. When executive action carries vast economic and political consequences, the court explained, the authority must be clearly granted by lawmakers. Without that clarity, separation of powers requires judicial correction. The ruling relied in part on what legal scholars call the major questions doctrine, which demands explicit statutory language before agencies or presidents undertake actions of extraordinary scale. Inside government offices and corporate headquarters, the reaction was immediate, but procedural rather than emotional. Trade attorneys began analyzing how existing duties would be unwound. Businesses that had structured contracts, supply chains, and pricing models around the tariff environment suddenly faced a new calculation. Importers explored whether they might seek reimbursement for duties paid. Federal agencies prepared guidance to address how customs enforcement would adapt to the invalidation of the policy's legal basis. The decision does not eliminate tariffs as a tool of economic policy. It clarifies that such measures must proceed through laws that explicitly authorize them, typically requiring congressional participation. That distinction is critical. The court addressed the method, not the policy objective. Future administrations may still pursue tariffs, but only through statutory frameworks designed for that purpose, rather than emergency declarations. By midday, analysts described the ruling as a structural reset rather than a policy verdict. The judiciary had not weighed trade strategy. It had reinforced institutional boundaries, returning responsibility for major economic decisions to the legislative branch, where constitutional design places it. As the decision moved from legal text into practical reality, attention turned to how the tariff program had been constructed and why it ultimately failed judicial scrutiny. The administration's approach relied on interpreting emergency authority broadly enough to classify long-standing trade imbalances and supply chain concerns as national security threats. That interpretation allowed tariffs to be introduced without the lengthy legislative process typically required for major trade action. Challengers argued that such reasoning transformed a law intended for targeted economic sanctions into a mechanism capable of reshaping global commerce. During litigation, business associations, importers, and several states maintained that the statute cited by the government did not even mention tariffs. They contended that if emergency language could justify sweeping import duties, then nearly any economic condition could be framed as a crisis permitting unilateral action. The court found that argument persuasive, concluding that Congress had never clearly authorized tariffs under that statute, and that stretching the law to cover them would effectively transfer legislative power to the executive branch. The ruling underscores a long-standing constitutional principle. While Congress may delegate certain authorities, it must do so explicitly, particularly when the consequences involve national economic restructuring. The justices observed that tariffs affect pricing systems, international negotiations, and domestic industries simultaneously, placing them among the most consequential tools of economic governance. Because of that scale, they require unmistakable legislative approval. For businesses, the transition away from the tariff framework introduces both opportunity and complexity. Some manufacturers had benefited from protective pricing that limited foreign competition, while companies dependent on imported materials faced increased costs during the tariff period. Now, each sector must reassess its position. Contracts negotiated under tariff assumptions cannot simply be undone. Supply chains redesigned to avoid duties may remain in place if they prove deficient, even without legal pressure to maintain them. Federal agencies also confront administrative challenges. Customs authorities must determine how to process entries previously subject to the invalidated tariffs and how to respond to potential refund claims. Regulatory adjustments require formal notices, internal reviews, and coordination across departments responsible for trade enforcement, taxation, and international agreements. International partners have interpreted the decision as evidence of institutional checks functioning within the American system. Governments that had criticized the tariffs as unilateral now observe policy authority returning to Congress, where future trade measures will likely emerge through negotiation rather than sudden declaration. By late afternoon, the immediate question was no longer whether the tariffs would survive, but how economic actors would adapt to their legal removal. The shift represents not an end to trade disputes, but a redefinition of the pathway through which they must now be pursued. In the hours following the ruling, financial markets reacted as participants absorbed not only the policy change, but also the restoration of procedural clarity. Investors often respond less to the substance of trade measures than to the predictability of how they are created. The court's decision signaled that major economic actions must once again pass through established legislative channels, reducing the likelihood of abrupt policy shifts introduced solely through executive declaration. That expectation of a more structured process influenced trading behavior, corporate forecasts, and long-term planning models. Trade specialists emphasized that the tariffs had functioned as both an economic instrument and a negotiating signal. Their sudden legal removal does not instantly reverse the strategic adjustments made over several years. Companies that diversified suppliers or relocated production to mitigate tariff exposure must evaluate whether reverting to earlier arrangements would be cost-effective or disruptive. Economic systems rarely snap back to their original configuration. They evolve incrementally as businesses test new conditions. Within federal departments, the decision prompted renewed scrutiny of how emergency economic authorities are interpreted. Legal teams began reviewing other policies to ensure that any significant regulatory actions rest on statutes clearly authorizing their scope. This internal reassessment reflects a broader administrative pattern that follows major judicial rulings. Agencies seek to align future initiatives with the court's guidance to avoid similar legal vulnerabilities. Members of Congress now occupy a more central role in shaping trade strategy. Legislators who previously reacted to executive tariff decisions must determine whether to draft new laws if comparable measures are desired. Such legislation would require committee hearings, economic analysis, and negotiation among representatives whose districts experience trade impacts differently. The legislative process introduces transparency and deliberation, but it also slows the pace of sweeping economic change. Abroad, trading partners have interpreted the ruling as an institutional recalibration rather than a geopolitical shift. While disagreements over market access, subsidies, and industrial competition persist, foreign governments now anticipate that future U.S. tariff proposals will emerge through debate in Congress, where alliances and compromises influence outcomes. Legal scholars view the decision as part of an evolving judicial approach, demanding precise authorization for actions with expansive national consequences. This trend reinforces the constitutional distribution of authority, ensuring that transformative economic measures originate in legislation rather than inference. By the close of the trading day, discussions centered on adaptation. Markets stabilized, agencies revised procedures, and lawmakers weighed potential responses. The court had spoken, not to dictate economic philosophy, but to reaffirm how significant policy must be created within the constitutional framework. As the immediate legal debate subsided, the focus shifted toward implementation, where judicial decisions translate into administrative practice and economic adjustment. Federal agencies must now dismantle the framework that governed how the tariffs were assessed and enforced. That process involves issuing updated customs guidance, recalculating entries, and coordinating with importers whose transactions were structured under the prior system. Such transitions require months of technical work rather than sudden change, as regulatory language, accounting procedures, and compliance systems are revised to align with the court's interpretation. For businesses, the adjustment represents another phase of strategic recalibration. Some companies anticipate lower import costs, while others must reconsider investments made to adapt to tariff protections. Factories expanded to compete under shielded pricing may now face renewed foreign competition, while logistics networks designed to bypass duties must determine whether to maintain or alter their routes. Economic policy shifts leave durable operational footprints, and firms often respond cautiously until new conditions prove stable. The decision also redefines how future administrations approach trade enforcement. Presidents retain authority to negotiate agreements and recommend tariff actions, but large-scale measures must now proceed through statutes explicitly authorizing them. That requirement directs attention back to Congress, where hearings, debate, and legislative compromise shape the final form of economic regulation. In practical terms, policymaking becomes more collaborative, though potentially slower, as multiple institutions participate in defining trade strategy. International observers interpret the ruling as confirmation that American governance mechanisms continue to distribute power among branches rather than concentrating it in a single office. Allies and competitors alike recognize that future disputes over tariffs or market access will likely involve legislative negotiation and legal review before implementation. This expectation influences diplomatic calculations, as trading partners anticipate a more structured pathway for resolving disagreements. From a constitutional standpoint, the case illustrates how foundational principles operate even in complex areas like global commerce. Separation of powers is often discussed in abstract language, yet here it directly shaped economic policy by determining which branch could act. The court did not eliminate tariffs or endorse a particular trade philosophy. It insisted that decisions with nationwide consequences follow the process outlined in law. As agencies revise regulations, companies adapt strategies, and lawmakers consider whether new legislation is warranted, the system returns to its routine functions. The tariffs at issue no longer stand on the authority that created them. What follows will emerge through legislative debate, negotiated policy, and administrative execution rather than emergency declaration. The ruling closes one chapter of trade policy while reopening the institutional channels through which future economic decisions must now travel.